Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, a senior police officer has appealed for help to tackle knife crime after what police called a truly unusual number of fatal stabbings over New Year. 4 young men died in London on New Year's Eve in unrelated activities and the early hours of January the 1st, whilst there were other knife attacks around the country. The Met's Deputy Commissioner, Craig Mackay, said it wasn't just about resources, but tackling the underlying issues behind knife culture. Simeon Brown has this report.
In South London's Tulse Hill, there are flowers for a young man who in 2018 would have turned 18. But he died just minutes before the clock struck midnight from a single stab wound to the chest. There is also mourning in North London's Enfield, in the East End community of West Ham, and here in Old Street, where officers are combing through the undergrowth at the scene of yet another fatal stabbing. In the early hours of the new year, a 20-year-old man was stabbed to death here in central London following a house party. He was one of 4 to lose his life in an unrelated wave of killings across the capital. Last year, 80 people were stabbed to death here, and the fear is that in 2018 it's a new year, but we may be seeing an old story. Police in England and Wales recorded almost 37,000 offences involving a knife or sharp instrument in the year ending June 2017. That's a 26% increase compared with the previous year. And it was London which saw the biggest increase, accounting for 47% of the rise across England and Wales. The police are yet to release the names of the New Year's knife victims, but we do know that they're all young men under 21. The Metropolitan Police have called the number of deaths in such a short period unusual.
The reality is millions of people enjoyed a safe and peaceful New Year in London. The tragedy is that we saw the scourge of knife crime that we've seen throughout the last few years on the streets of London on that night. You can't describe it anything other than a tragedy for the families and people and those communities affected.
But there were further acts of New Year's knife violence outside the capital. In Sheffield, 2 were critically injured following a fight at this bar. But it's London that has driven the rise in violence, with teenagers being almost a quarter of all knife murders last year. In response, the mayor launched this campaign.
London needs me alive.
London needs me alive.
London needs me alive.
So I don't carry a knife.
But following the year's start, the question is, how do we keep young people safe?
Well, I'm joined now by Temi Mwale, the founding director of the Forefront Project, which focuses on empowering young people to live free from violence, and from Birmingham, the community activist and former gang member himself, Simeon Moore. And let me begin with you, Simeon. The police are talking about trying to understand the underlying causes of this kind of crime. What would you say they are?
Well, I mean, for me, there's many underlying factors that cause knife crime and gang crime and street violence on a whole. I think for me, the main thing is the negative mentality and the negativity in youth culture. I think the police and the government look at these things and they don't tackle the real issues. They're tackling knife crime or gang crime or gun crime, and they're not tackling the actual issue, which is negative mentality.
Well, how can the police and government tackle a negative mentality in youth culture, as you describe it? And what is that? Because I'm sure a lot of people listening to this won't really know what you mean by that.
Okay, so when I'm saying negative mentality, I'm talking about a road mentality, if that even makes any more sense. Yeah, a street mentality, you know, where fast cars, big chains, robberies, selling drugs is glorified. And I think what needs to be done is more to do with shifting the culture, because this is a culture that we're dealing with, and it's a culture that's promoting negativity. So we need to be tackling that rather than trying to tackle knife crime. Let's tackle what the real issues are, and that's it's the mentality of the young people that live across the country.
Let me bring in Temi Mwale. How can the authorities tackle that kind of culture? It's nothing to do with them, is it? They don't create it.
Well, it's easy to say that it's not created, but we live in a very violent society, so it's just, we can see violence in every form within society, whether it's within our media, we can see violence. The state is even violent from time to time, so I think it's easy to just look at youth violence, knife crime, gun crime, separate and detach it from that, but we can't. If we really want to understand it and deal with it, we need to look at youth violence in context of all this other violence happening in society as well.
I mean, I know you've done a lot of travelling around the world, looking at, you know, the kinds of things they're doing in America and other parts of Britain. What have you learned from what you've seen? You know, who's getting it right?
I think the people that have tried to make a shift away from a criminal enforcement model, one that only looks to punish people and use the criminal justice system, to one that actually looks at public health, that looks at trauma, that looks at young people's needs and works with communities holistically, these are the people that are getting it right.
So a crackdown on knives is pointless, is it?
So I've made this argument before. We focus on knives and knife crime, but in America it's guns. They don't really have knife crime to the same extent. We can really focus on the weapon, but we're going to miss what's really happening. If we don't address why people are carrying the weapons, whether it's a gun or a knife, it doesn't matter. It's why people feel like they have to resolve their conflicts using violence. That's what we need to address. Because
a lot of politicians think you need to have a zero-tolerance approach to the carrying of knives and the use of knives, and that we are just too lenient.
OK, well, let's be honest. In 2015, we introduced mandatory minimum sentencing for knife crime, 6 months if you're 18, 4 months if you're 16, if you're caught with a knife 2 times. This doesn't work. It's not a deterrent. The young people that we work with tell us all the time, unless you know, they would rather go to prison than be killed. And no one is dealing with the fact that they feel like their lives are under threat. That's what's driving them a lot of the time to be carrying weapons in the first place. And so a zero tolerance is just more pain. It's just more, these harsh measures don't actually address how young people are feeling.
So can you give the police or the government a concrete thing they could do?
I think in terms of the police, the police's role is enforcement. We understand that. I feel like we can't be reliant on the police and look to them as the only people that can resolve this. We can't. And like I said earlier today, I think especially when it comes to the flawed and fractured relationship that the police have with particular communities and with young people in particular, it means that this is driving violence because young people cannot rely on the police.
You're talking about race.
I'm talking partly about race, but not just that. There's a class issue there as well. It's just that young people are being criminalised a lot of the time. I don't know any young people that I've ever worked with that have felt like when their life is under threat, they could call the police and say, my life is under threat.
You know, but if they are criminal, they will be criminalised. You know, if they are carrying knives, you know, they've crossed the line, haven't they? So how do you stop that cycle?
I think in terms of what you said before about what can the government do, government and police, let's separate it out. The police are an arm of the state. The government can do more, and we haven't done anything radically different for over 18 years to deal with violence at all. And I think what the government needs to do is look at long-term investment, long-term solutions, strategies that are in it for the long run. This is working with young people holistically, not quick fix solutions. Nothing's going to work. Short-term, 3-week programs are not going to change people's mindsets. As Simeon has said, this is a culture. And when I say culture, I'm not doing a dog whistle to race there. I mean, this is something that is pervasive in society, that is violent, and we need to be addressing young people for the long term.
Simeon, let me just come back to you finally. I mean, if you're talking about youth culture and what people think is desirable or cool or whatever it is that they want to call it, I mean, don't you have to throw back the responsibility on young people themselves as well, and their parents and their leaders and whoever may be in a position of influence? It's not just the authorities who can do things here.
Nah, definitely. To be fair, I think this is an issue that needs to be tackled from the ground upwards. So even in terms of what the government can do more of, the government needs to invest more in young men and women, probably like myself and the young lady that you're speaking to, that have come from that background and are trying to actively make those positive changes. I think in terms of families need to... Our family structure is broken down anyway, so we need to rebuild that family structure back where the kids listen to the parents, the kids listen to their elders, not just the families, the elders within their community. All that has been broken down, so there's a lot of issues here. But I think the government, what the government could do more of also is, and the media themselves, because a lot of this culture is pushed through the media. So I think the media needs to be challenged, and the government needs to be doing the challenging and saying why is the media and media outlets allowing this negative imagery and this negative message to be pushed so much.
Simeon Moore and Temi Mwali, thank you both very much.